This episode of Analog Toys would not have been possible without the incredible generosity of former Palitoy toy designer Bob Brechin. His story, his archival sketches and photographs, and his unique perspective into the development of this magnificent toy have enabled me to produce a video that I'm very proud of, and one that Action Force fans all over the world will be truly thankful for. Bob, this video is dedicated to you. Hello Action Force fans, my name is Tony and welcome to an Analog Toys special feature. The birth of Roboskull and the origin of Palitoy's Action Force. The Roboskull is a fantastically unique action figure toy with a genuinely terrifying design, and one that collectors have grown to appreciate more and more as time has passed. In fact, this toy has become so collectible that a complete box Roboskull sold in January 2018 for over £1,000 sterling, and the box wasn't even sealed. But in order to provide some context behind this astonishing otherworldly toy, we must first explain the introduction of Palitoy's Action Force that made its debut in 1982. In the beginning, Palitoy's Action Force toy line was born out of the popularity of Star Wars toys and the new industry standard for 3 3/4 inch scaled action figures. This new standard impacted sales of Palitoy's former market leader, the 12-inch Action Man figure, which had ruled the boys' toy market for well over a decade. Attempts were made by Palitoy to ride the Star Wars hype train by launching the Action Man Space Rangers, but it was a losing battle. The smaller scale Star Wars toys meant that kids were able to get more for their money, and this new concept changed the way that children played. Star Wars had been developed by Palitoy's American sister company Kenner, which meant that Palitoy had the license to produce the Star Wars figures and toys in the UK, toys that were based on the sensational film. Having the most successful boys' toy range of the 70s, Action Man, and the new sensation Star Wars, Palitoy was able to manage its marketing plans accordingly. In 1981, the decision was made to support the Action Man brand by launching a 3 3/4 inch version of the 12-inch action figure. The range was entitled Action Force, but the packaging also carried the Action Man logo to maintain continuity. Continuity was also maintained by producing the 12 best-selling Action Man outfits in the 3 3/4 inch scale. However, this thinking was not adopted when it came to the vehicles. The best-selling Land Rover and Scorpion tank were not produced in the Action Force scale. Marketing instructed the design department to develop 3 new vehicles to complement the 3 3/4 inch Action Force figures. It seemed a bit of an odd decision at the time, but it would help in the repositioning of the concept later on.
Come to review your Action Force, Commander?
Yes, I have.
How many will Sir be requiring for his mission?
But I am short of 1 British Marine.
Will he be needing transport? Or will you base him at HQ? Good luck, sir. I expect we'll be seeing you again.
Yes, and take charge of the rest of the men till I return, Sergeant!
Yes, sir!
Action Man presents new Action Force minifigures.
In its first year, Action Force became very popular, second only to Star Wars, and in the month before Christmas 1982, it was in fact top-selling boys' toy. However, the incumbent Palitoy management team caught wind of General Mills' plans for the future of the toy group and jumped ship to other companies. And by 1982, there was a new managing director at the helm and a completely new marketing team. New personnel equal new ideas. The design department was given the brief to adapt the existing Action Force range into a new, modern-looking concept, something that the design department had been keen to do right from the start. Design and marketing sat down together and after much brain activity finally came up with the concept of Baron Ironblood and the Red Shadows, a secretive organisation hell-bent on world domination. The United Nations responded by forming the Action Force, which consisted of 4 teams of expert military units. Z-Force, the conventional land army group, Q-Force for action on and under the sea, Space Force for conflict in the skies and space around Earth, and the SAS for covert operations behind enemy lines. Baron Ironblood was positioned as an intelligent megalomaniac with brilliant skills and powers of persuasion. He wore a Ned Kelly-styled helmet and ruled his forces with an iron fist. His army of Red Shadows was made up of disaffected, easily influenced deserters from all the armies of the world, and his right-hand man, the Black Major, commanded them. Supporting the Red Shadows were robots and cyborgs developed in the Baron's secret laboratories, such as the Mouton. Considering themselves similar to the pirates that ravaged the Seven Seas during the 17th century, the Baron's cohorts adopted the skull and crossbones as their rallying symbol. Due to the lack of investment for new tooling, the design department was tasked with adapting new figures from existing components, so various different bodies, heads and legs were all swapped around and moulded in different colours to create new characters.
Gentlemen, the world is in terrible peril from this man, Baron Ironblood, an evil genius who is determined to rule the world. These are the creatures he has created to help him. Now you must create your own action force dedicated to the Baron's downfall. Captain Campbell, you will take command of Z-Force, land-based attack troops. Captain Buckingham, the SAS, crack commando squad. Captain McLaren, Q-Force, Subaquatics, and Captain Connors, Space Force. Expect the unexpected. Where will the Baron strike next? Action Force toys, the battle has just begun.
The Z-Force was moulded in a green and black camo pattern. The Q-Force was moulded in yellow, the Space Force in orange and grey, and the SAS were all black with yellow insignia. The Baron's army was predominantly red except for the Black Major, and the man himself who was dressed in white. The vehicles, because they began life as new designs and not based off previous Action Man vehicles, were easily adapted and recoloured for the new concept. When Palitoy originally initiated the development of Action Force in 1981, the previous management had no idea that Hasbro in the United States had embarked on the very same project to introduce G.I. Joe in the 3 3/4 inch scale to take on Star Wars. Palitoy's tooling development was already well underway and marketing plans were in place when Hasbro's new G.I. Joe range was unveiled at the 1982 New York Toy Fair. Having the license agreement for Action Man from Hasbro made it possible for Palitoy to borrow tooling for some 3 3/4 inch G.I. Joe vehicles and recolour them to fit into the Action Force teams for 1983. For example, the G.I. Joe Amphibious Personnel Carrier became the Action Force Z-Force Armoured Troop Carrier. The G.I. Joe Wolverine became the Action Force SAS Wolverine, and the Cobra Hiss tank became the Red Shadow's Hyena. Some of the G.I. Joe figures were also recoloured and brought into the Action Force line, but these figures were only sold with vehicles. The reason for this was that G.I. Joe figures had twice as many points of articulation as Action Force figures, and the Hasbro figures could be positioned with bending knees in the sitting position, an ideal pose for a vehicle driver. Because of the very limited development time, it was expedient that Palitoy copied the Kenner Star Wars action figure design that featured only 5 points of articulation. This 5 POA design, it was simple, it required the minimum amount of tooling, and it had already been tried and tested by the Star Wars range. Hasbro, however, obviously took a little bit more time to consider the articulation options before introducing the G.I. Joe range. The new Action Force concept was very popular with kids when launched in 1983. And it looked like marketing would be expanding the range based on new G.I. Joe products. However, Palitoy's designers wanted to make sure that their input continued, so creative juices began to flow in the design department. Brian Turner came up with a model of an undersea craft for Q-Force, which was subsequently restyled by freelance toy designers Raffo and Pape to become the Action Force Sea Lion. Bob Brechin sketched ideas for a new spacecraft for the Space Force that was realised by Palitoy model maker Kevin Heath and would eventually become the Triad Fighter. The various different Action Force units were getting fully fleshed out with a wide assortment of different vehicles, and although the enemy had a few vehicles of their own, what was really missing was an iconic flagship vehicle for the Red Shadows. Bob Brechin, the lead designer for Palitoy's Action Force, sat down and sketched umpteen drawings of vehicles, all based on the Red Shadow symbol, the skull and crossbones. He chose one which was a flying machine, loosely inspired by the Star Wars TIE Fighter. The skull was then sculpted in styling wax, and wings and other components were created, tried and rejected until a final model evolved. A pilot for this new flying machine, which could operate in the skies around the Earth but also in the vacuum of space, was needed. Staying with the skull theme, a robotic skeleton figure was developed to fly the craft. The new vehicle was presented at the new products meeting with its pilot, who Bob had named the Roboskull. At this new products meeting, the vehicle was unanimously accepted, and it needed a name. "The vehicle is the Roboskull, not the pilot," was the cry from the audience. So a new pilot figure was needed. The skeleton robot was also accepted, but was destined to become a standalone mail-away item. Bob Brechin later sculpted the new pilot Red Wolf, and the original pilot became known as Skeletron. With the decision to move the Roboskull forward to the development stage, and with Toy Fair rapidly approaching, Bob Brechin was virtually given carte blanche to develop the final design, produce a working prototype, and complete component drawings without going through the normal stages of design approval. A plastics moulding company called RTD was chosen to do this as they had both prototyping and technical drawing facilities in-house. But first, something had to be sketched out so they could start this work. Taking the original model as a starting point, Bob began with some elevation drawings to determine the overall size and form based on the size of the action figures. As well as the pilot's cockpit, Bob wanted to have room for another enemy figure, so space for a rear gunner was added to the overall design. Bob also felt it was a good idea to incorporate a feature that involved the Action Force team, the good guys, so the idea of having a prison for captured soldiers was adopted. This eventually became a brainwashing unit to turn the good guys into Red Shadows. Having decided that the craft would hold 3 figures, giving it a lot more play value, the basic size and shape was established. Development then moved on to the assembly and design of the wings of this frightening enemy aircraft. Exploded drawings were produced, and this is when the initial idea to make the wings rotate was finally resolved. By utilising this design, the Roboskull could operate as a VTOL, a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, with the Roboskull resting on its propulsion units when grounded. Before entering the final stages of building the prototype, the Roboskull's face was sculpted by freelance artist Ron Cameron, who had designed the original Action Force figures back in 1981. This sculpture was presented to RTD, who took a mould, and from that they produced a resin copy. Next, the basic body shell was produced by RTD's model makers, one that fitted around the Roboskull's face. With this 3D interpretation of Bob Brechin's initial sketches, he was able to prove that the 3 action figures would actually fit into the final design. The next stage was to work out the mechanism that would connect the wings through the centre of the fuselage. One significant modification occurred at this time, and that was to change the one-piece cockpit into 2 separate mouldings to access the pilot's area and that of the rear gunner. The design of the access door to the brainwashing compartment on the underneath of the craft was also established, as was the shaping of the engine block that protruded from the rear of the Roboskull's fuselage. With the main body shape established, attention was now paid to the design of the wings. Bob produced drawings that reflected his vision of soaring forms inspired by medieval cathedrals. Bob also wanted the wings to be moulded in a light grey clear plastic, so the wings were cast in a grey transparent material. 2 grey opaque engine pods were added to each wing, which were made as 2 components that snapped together, trapping the edge of the wing. 4 engine cowls were then moulded as separate red components, to be snapped on below the engine pods. They were shaped to appear as solid stable bases when the Roboskull was sitting at rest, in the same way the pediments of the cathedral's columns gave it that solidity and connection to the earth it stood on. With the design of the main body and wings complete, and the mechanism between the wings worked out, the Roboskull prototype was nearing completion. The next stage of design established the need for the Roboskull to be decked out with some fearsome weaponry. Cannons were fitted to each side of the wings, and 2 further armaments were added to each side of the jawline of the craft. The deep-set eye sockets of the Roboskull were crying out for something, so 2 smaller weapons were added there too. Finally, the rear gunner obviously had his weapons to ward off enemy attack. When the prototype was finally completed by RTD, in the colours Bob had specified, he took possession of the model, and back at the Palitoy office in Colville, he called in freelance graphic artist Dave Barnacle to brief him on some distinctive labels to complete the job. Dave would also use photographs of the labelled prototype to develop the packaging mock-up. Lastly, an instruction leaflet was needed to instruct the child how to assemble the Roboskull. But Bob Brechin thought a spoof blueprint was needed, as if it was top secret from the Iron Blood laboratories. He sketched out the design and got Dave Barnacle to produce the final artwork. The prototype Roboskull model was finally completed, and just in time for the January Toy Fair. Roger Morrison, Palitoy's tooling manager, took possession of the component drawings, with injection moulding tooling being completed soon after.
The Z-Force armored troop carrier is ambushed by the hideous Roboskull, the Baron's ultimate weapon. Only the Triad fighter can draw its fire, while the SAS and Z-Force make their escape. The second Triad moves in. Roboskull is down but not out. And where will the Baron strike next? Action Force Toys, the battle has just begun.
I consider Roboskull to be one of my most successful toy designs, something I am proud to leave as a testimony of my time with Palitoy. It has also been developing a very interesting legacy along with Baron Ironblood, Black Major and the Red Shadows. Designing for Action Man from 1967 right through to its demise in 1984 was more than just okay, but in the early days it basically involved taking something that existed, or once existed, and scaling it down to Action Man size. Things began to change in 1977 when Palitoy Marketing introduced Hasbro's G.I. Joe fantasy characters, Bulletman, the Intruder, and also to counter $6 Million Man, Atomic Man. A few years later, with the advent of Star Wars, and in order to survive the demand from kids for all things out of this world, the Palitoy design team ushered in the Action Man Space Rangers. In the prosaic military field, it wasn't until we employed Greg Hughes that the policy of copying changed when he came up with the exciting concept of the Special Team in 1981. His vision of what military personnel may look like in 20 to 30 years' time. Product manager Mike Taylor wanted to use the 12 best-selling Action Man outfits, which included those such as the old deep-sea diver and the long-standing German stormtrooper. The new Palitoy marketing team in 1982 decided to reposition Action Force from what was essentially Mini Action Man to a fantasy concept. It gave me and the design team the freedom to use our imaginations. Since the growth of toy collecting, mainly by those that were kids during the 60s, 70s and 80s, Action Force has been part of this trend, especially the Red Shadows, which have appeared in the American G.I. Joe comics. Roboskull was also made familiar to the readers when Larry Hama featured it in the G.I. Joe comics. And now it has been developed as a customised black shiny metalised variant, and also as a super 12-inch Action Man scaled version by American designer and collector Kate McLeod. Other enthusiasts have produced other strange adaptations, including one based upon the Star Wars AT-AT and another based on the TIE Fighter. Roboskull has appeared on a t-shirt by Chris McLeod and is featured in Blood for the Baron's Collector's Guide, the definitive record of all the Action Force range, recently published by Jim Marshall. As I speak today, I've just received a Full Force 2018 calendar from Brian Hickey, with Roboskull dramatically featured for the month of June. My dream is that one day an actual sized Roboskull may be seen in a theme park in which kids would be able to enter dressed in a Red Wolf costume. The Roboskull legacy is fully established, and I hope it continues.
The Roboskull is simultaneously the most unique and most iconic toy ever produced for the Action Force line. And even though Palitoy quite often simply just recoloured G.I. Joe products, it proved that when they were given the right resources, designers like Bob Brechin were capable of producing such magnificent toy masterpieces as Palitoy's Roboskull. Vintage Roboskull vehicles are not an easy toy to find today, and if you're lucky enough to seek one out on the collector's market, they won't be found cheaply. So do your research and make sure the toy is complete, because many of the accessories, like the red engine cows and the laser cannons, are often missing. But once you add this piece to your vintage Action Force collection, you certainly won't regret it. The Roboskull is a product with immense play value and a wonderfully outlandish design aesthetic that ranks as the most collectible vehicle in the entire Action Force toy line. I score Palitoy's Roboskull 6 out of 5. So that's our review of the Palitoy Action Force Roboskull. Did you agree with our score? Please leave us a comment in the section below, and if you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.
Baron Ironblood's introduction of the laser exterminator has forced the country to expand its military capacity. Underwater with Q-Force, seen here operating from their floating missile base. In space from this cosmic cruiser. And revealed tonight for the first time, the newly developed Z-Force battle tank. Supporting it on land, the SAS missile system, attack jeep and the Z-Force cannon. More news as it's made from new Action Force.